This last tutorial is on the muscle lectures, and it's going to go over quickly the function of muscle, the organization of the muscle, and how muscles are repaired, which are kind of the main points of the lecture. And so we're starting off with the function. So we know that muscle, it's basically, it acts as a lever. So if you would have this bone and this bone, there's a muscle attached between the two of them. When that muscle undergoes contraction, it becomes shorter, which allows that joint to move. So we can see here, this is where it moved. And it does this by creating ATP. So everything in the muscle is pumping out ATP so that contraction can occur. So with this in mind, we can go over the main functions of muscle. So there are 5 main functions, 1, 2, 3, 5, and we'll link them all to that lever function. So first we have the movement, which is the most obvious one. So with our muscles, we're able to walk around, move stuff. So that's the main one. We can imagine that with the whole lever thing. So it allows us to move our arms and legs and body. That's the first one. The next one is stability. So imagine if you're just a skeleton and you just got sat down somewhere, they would fall over immediately. So the muscle allows us to stay still. It also is able to provide stability around joints by keeping things tight and making sure that it doesn't just wave around everywhere. Then we have communication, which is kind of inferred because you use muscles to be able to talk, and also body language. Also like control of body passages. So we all know about the sphincters and stuff. And also our eyelids and our pupils are controlled by little muscles. So all of that type of stuff, all of the little things it controls. And also another one is heat production. And that's because when we create all of that ATP, a lot of heat is being produced at the same time. So that's why skeletal muscle is important, because it produces, I think, around 85% of our body heat, which is quite a lot because you need to maintain that 37 degrees Celsius in our body. Because of all of the enzyme function and everything. So we have the most obvious ones, and then we have some weird ones, but they're all important. So that's why sometimes I like to ask questions on it. Now we'll go over the organization. There are a couple levels that they organize the muscles in the lecture. First is the general anatomy. So it's talking about, so imagine this is a bone, and this is another bone. A muscle is made up of kind of 2 parts. You have the tendon, which connects muscle to bone. Then you have your muscle here. So you have this osteotendinous junction, we'll call it OTJ, and so osteo is bone, tendinous is the tendon junction, so it's the joint between the tendon and the bone, and that's the most strong out of the 2 joints I'm going to talk about, or junctions, and it's because it has Sharpie fibers, which kind of ossify and join into the bone, so they kind of merge together really well. Whereas these joints here, myotendinous junction, so myobone tendon junction, are less strong, because if you were to try to rip a muscle off a bone, it would be the muscle ripping off the tendon, not the tendon ripping off the bone, because this one is much stronger. Also, a note is there's an origin. When we talk about muscles, origin and insertion. So basically where the muscle's coming from and where it's going. Origin to insertion. And the general rule is the origin moves less. This one moves the most. So if you were to flex your arm, your forearm would move, but your top of like your arm wouldn't move. So that's why the bottom, this part, would be the insertion. This would be the origin, because when you flex this one moves the most, but then this joint kind of stays still. So it's origin and insertion. The next level of organization that they talk about is like the fascicles and muscle down to myofibril. And it's a bit easier to look at it in a diagram. So I'll use this one. So we can talk about the actual meaty parts, and then we can talk about what cover the meaty parts, because they ask questions about both of them. So we'll go over the actual little meaty parts. So it starts with those myofibrils, which were in BioSci 106. So they had, those are things with the A line and stuff, and the Z line, M line. I'm not sure if they'll ask too many questions on it, but they could always ask questions, so always be aware of old content. So we have that myofibril, and those are like little fibers, muscle fibers, and those are within the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. The muscle fibers and muscle cells are called the same thing because muscle cells are so long that they look like fibers. That's why they call it basically the same thing. So the myofibril is this tiny thing. Then the muscle fiber is made up of lots of them. So we can see them. This is it here. Then next, we have a fascicle, which is made up of lots of muscle fibers. Then next, we have this whole basically muscle. And a muscle is made up of many fascicles. So basically anything that's big is made up of something smaller, and the next one, all the way goes down to a myofibril. So just order it. So 1, 2, 3, 4 from biggest to smallest. Then we have to talk about what cover them, because it allows for compartments to be formed. So if we go down, we have that sarcolemma, which is covering it, then endomysium, then perimysium, epimysium, and then we have the deep fascia on the big level. Endomysium is a connective tissue that surrounds lots of muscle fibers. So this one kind of links with this one. And then myofibril is surrounded by sarcolemma, which is basically like the cell membrane. Then we have the perimysium, which covers all of these muscle fascicles. And then the epimysium covers all of these individual like muscles. So if that was a muscle, this would be all covered by epimysium, which we can see here. And then the biggest one is the deep fascia, which would group together lots of muscles. So when I refer to muscles, I'll talk about these things, muscles. Like the level of a muscle that would have its own name. So that's what I refer to when I say muscle. So a deep fascia would cover many muscles depending on where it is. Like in this diagram here, this is the deep fascia, and it covers multiple muscles. And each set of muscles here within a deep fascia have their own roles. So that, and then also this one over here. And a way to remember kind of dorsiflexor versus plantar flexor is dorsiflexors, if you imagine you're standing here and you went to kick down a door, your foot would be pointed backwards here. So it's pulling your foot up. Whereas plantar flexors up here, you imagine you're standing on some grass and there are plants, and you wanted to point your foot at the plant, you would point your foot. Imagine that was your toe. So plantar flexors, you're pointing, dorsiflexors, you're pulling up. They might ask questions on that in the test or exam. Here. And just to finish off, we'll talk about this compartment level organization of muscles. So as I said, each compartment is surrounded by a deep fascia, and within each compartment, the muscles do a certain role. So that's easy to remember because you can remember that, oh, this compartment does this movement, whereas this compartment does a separate movement. And then when you're learning like individual muscles, you'll realize that they all do the same movement because they're in the same compartment. But that's not too important. Just remember compartments, each muscle does a certain job. So we can see if we were to cut in, you'd go through the skin, then that subcutaneous tissue. So it's kind of like fat. And then we get to this deep fascia. And the deep fascia cover the muscles. And he could have talked about compartment syndrome, where imagine you had two big muscles, or if the blood vessel popped, it would fill up with heaps of blood, or the muscle would get too big, and it would get constricted by that fascia. And that fascia is pretty tight, and it's not moved. Like you can't stretch it out too easily. So heaps of pressure can build up, and that could block on something like this nerve, and it could cause damage or could cause pain. So that's why I say like the All Blacks had to cut open their fascias because the muscles in those compartments were too big. Another side note, they could ask about like intermuscular septa or interosseous septa. So interosseous, between the bones, intermuscular is so between two muscles without kind of touching the bone here. So this one here would be intermuscular because it's between two muscles. Then this one here would be between two bones, just as an example. And this is linking in with the groupings up here. We have that epimysium, which is covering each of the muscle groups. So here's a muscle group, here's another muscle, and they're covered by the epimysium. And then just quickly revise that deep fascia to the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, and then on the tiny level of the sarcolemma. Before we finish, we'll talk about how muscle is repaired, / how it decreases in size. So the body's always trying to remodel, it's trying to make everything as good as it can be. So if you were working out and you needed to use your muscles a lot, they would grow. But then say you didn't work out for a whole year and your muscles didn't kind of need to be there, they would eat them away so that they're able to better use the proteins or like the energy instead of trying to maintain this muscle mass. So cells are able to undergo hyperplasia, which is when there's an increase in the cell number, but that doesn't really happen in muscles. The way that muscles are able to increase in size and repair themselves is by hypertrophy. And that's when there's an increase in the number of myofibrils. So those myofibrils are those tiny little fibers within a cell. So if this was the outside of a cell and had a certain number of myofibrils, when you undergo hypertrophy, you increase the size by increasing the number of myofibrils in there. So increase number of myofibrils. So that's the main point. They don't increase in the number of cells, they increase in the number of myofibrils. So within a cell. So imagine the cell itself is going from like skinny to like chunky. And imagine if every single one of those little fibers up here increase in size. It'll go from like a tiny little muscle to like a big muscle. Okay. Hypertrophy. And the way that they decrease in size, it's kind of easy to remember. It's called atrophy. So it has the same thing at the end, so atrophy. And that's going in the opposite direction, so from big, lots of myofibrils, to small, not so many myofibrils. I'm going to end it at that. Not too sure all of the stuff that he added into the lecture, but this is the main points I had from last year. just how muscle grows. Main point is hypertrophy. How muscles are organized on like a big level, so that's in these compartments surrounded by deep fascia. You also need to remember stuff like compartment syndrome because they might link it into what could go wrong. Then you need to know the function of muscle. You can always relate that to what you see on the big levels, but you need to also remember the little stuff like communication and control of sphincters and little stuff in your body. And then also, this is stuff they like to ask. They could ask the order, they could try to switch around like what's covering a cell versus like the meaty parts. That's what I like to call them. And then also this level, so saying that this joint junction is stronger than this junction.